Welcome to the session for real-world representational state transfer with JavaScript object notation for the United States Environmental Protection Agency e-manifests. This is my own material, produced independently of Appeon. I thank Appeon for providing this opportunity to make this presentation. In this session, we will cover these topics: who I am, electronic manifests, the business process that produces them, how the messages are built. We'll look at code examples and examine resources for further study. Hello, my name is Jeff Wayt. I have 38 years in information technology and software development. I've pretty much worn all hats. My key skills are Power Builder, SQL Server, Oracle, SQL Anywhere, ASE. I've done applications with Word and Excel OLE. I've created a number of C# Windows services to allow for background processing using Power Builder.NET assemblies. I design my databases in Power Designer. I'm an associate of Intertech. I currently have ongoing development at Annapolis Microsystems and Fluor. "30 years ago, a partner of mine and I started to have our own business, and IOBar was incorporated in Texas in 1991. We're located in Houston. Its focus is software development with barcode integration. We have developed client-server supply chain applications for the clinical lab industry, as well as hazardous material compliance software, which will feature the REST application. Today, most of the current business is subcontracting Power Builder development and consulting through Intertech Consulting. Most of you know Don Clayton. I'm privileged to be a member of the Team Intertech. Don and I go way back to the high school for performing and visual arts when I was a senior and he was a sophomore. Almost 30 years later, we met again when I joined the HAL PC Special Interest Group for the Houston chapter of the International Sybase Users Group in 2005. Together we ran the group for about 5 or 6 years. We've been working together ever since. Intertech Consulting is the oldest and largest consulting firm specializing in Power Builder related technologies in North America. Intertech was the first company in North America independently certified by both Sybase and Appeon to sell and support the Appeon server, now called the Power Server product. Intertech is an Appeon consulting partner. It's been a SAP partner since 2012, a Sybase partner from 1997 to 2013, a PowerSoft partner from 1995 to 1997, and it's been a Microsoft partner from 1995 to present. Intertech does software architecture, consulting, programming, education, and project management. So what is an e-manifest? When someone moves hazardous material, the law requires the transporter to carry a manifest declaring what they are moving. Should there be an accident, it lets responders know how to deal with it. The EPA charges a fee to process a report. The fee is smaller if the filing is electronic. It also contains fewer errors. The EPA created a REST site for the application interface to file this information electronically. From a conceptual view, my customer uses WaytTrack, and WaytTrack uses the HTTPClient to send the electronic manifests in JSON form to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The process begins with a customer service rep entering a work order with profile information to process the wastes that they receive. The profile knows all of the chemical components and all of the hazards for reporting to the EPA and the Department of Transportation. Then the customer service rep prints a manifest for management to sign. And they scan it, and the customer service rep links the PDF image to WaytTrack by telling it where that image is kept. Then the customer service rep tells WaytTrack to send the manifest to the EPA. They go into a management screen to do that. The application begins a two-part dialogue with the EPA site hosting the REST API. The base URL is the domain that can switch from test to production. The functions of the API are then appended onto that. In this case, we have an authorization, and we use a user and password. So that creates the entire URL, and the HTTP client then executes a send request with a get method and passes it the URL. With good credentials, it returns a security token that we will pass in all the following requests. This step is as simple as Google Translate. Then we do a post save with the token in the header, an eManifest JSON in the body, and the zip as an attachment also in the body. And then that looks fairly similar. A send request, this time with a post method, to the URL for saving, passing it a blob body. And with any luck, we get a response that is a manifest number, which could be the one that's passed back to us, or one that's generated that they created. Or we get an error. And at first, this is what we would get, because we were missing something very important. This is not JSON. This is HTML. What we're getting here is a message that doesn't help us. In fact, it sends us in the wrong direction. At the bottom we see load JSON failed, missing a name for an object member. But it's got nothing to do with the JSON. I'll show that later. What does it have to do with? What would you guess? It looks like the problems with the JSON. The EPA site did describe the security token to put in the header, but that wasn't enough. The feedback needs to direct the user to acceptable action. The EPA developers told me I should check my JSON with the validator. I did that. I'll demonstrate that later. But that wasn't the problem, because it validated. What was it? Was it the encoding? There are different kinds of encoding, and creating a blob gives you a default that's incorrect. Finally, their developer was able to give me a little bit of time, and I was able to get him to look at the logs on the server of exactly what I sent and discover what the missing element was. But until then, I was stabbing in the dark. Error messages are very, very important. We both consume them and produce them. And maybe we can learn from this that when we produce error messages, that they lead the user in the proper direction, rather than simply complain that they're going in the wrong one. So the JSON there is pointed out right in the middle, but look at all the stuff that's surrounding it. Now we knew about the accept application JSON, and we knew that we had to put the authorization in the header. But here's this new thing on the green line 2. Content type multi-part form data and a boundary. That's the awesome sauce. That's what we needed. And the EPA site doesn't tell us anything about how to produce that. So the boundary must start with 4 dashes plus some unique string that occurs only for the sake of boundaries. We shouldn't see this string anywhere else. So how we produce this is we start out with a clear request header. These are all HTTPClient methods. And we set the request header for accept application JSON. That tells us this is what we will accept as a response. Not please accept this message. If the security token has already been passed, we're in the second phase of this, then we can set the request header for the content type and declare what the boundary is going to look like. And then we can set the authorization with the security token. So after declaring the boundary, we have a 2 dash prefix before the boundary introduces the usage of the boundary, followed by the new part of the content. So here we're talking about content disposition, which is remember this is in the body for the form data, and the part that we're going to be using here is the manifest. 2 line breaks, and then we have our body. The body has, as you've seen before, has the JSON for the actual manifest as it gets constructed. This is just simply telling it, here comes a manifest. We take that and we turn it into a blob using the UTF-8 encoding. If we didn't specify encoding UTF-8, then it would use UTF-16 little endian, and that's not going to work. So at the end of that, the final boundary is going to be our boundary form. It's a carriage return line feed, 2 dashes, here's the boundary, and then it's going to be followed by 2 more dashes and a line break as well. If we have an attachment, then we have a whole bunch of other stuff to do, like getting the name of the file and then producing a little header of that section in the body. This time we're saying this is an attachment and we have a file name involved, and that file is a compressed zip, and that we're going to be transferring it in binary coding, not base 64. Then we have 2 line breaks, and we take that and encode it into a blob with UTF-8. The blob for data came from reading in that file, that's the zip file. So now we're going to create a body with the manifest, then the attachment, and then the bookend. And if we don't have an attachment, then it's just the manifest and the bookend. Finally, we do the send request with a post to the URL that has the save function, and we pass it the body in a blob form. So now let's take a look at some examples of how we generate JSON. So this is a part of the message. It's a JSON object, and it deals with an object, a named object called hazardous waste. That has sub-objects, and the first object is going to be a named array of federal waste codes. Those have multiple codes, 1 or more, or none, but we wouldn't really be calling for the federal waste code if it didn't have any. So what we're going to be doing is using PowerScript to map the data elements in the data store to the JSON format shown at the right. There's a named object containing 2 named arrays. So we've determined that we do have EPA waste, so we're going to create the hazardous waste by adding an item object. So we name that item object hazardous waste, and that's what appears here. Then we tell it to add an item array, and we call that item array federal waste codes. So that's this. Notice the square brackets. That's an array. Then we add the object. It's not named, but it does have a string that we're going to add called code and value. If we have a second EPA code, we do it again. Continuing on, if we have a state waste code and it's Texas, then we can create a new named array called TX waste codes, and we'll be adding the objects with a code and a value just like we did before. But if it's not Texas, then we add something else, and that would be the generator state waste codes. And possibly we don't have any EPA waste, in which case we would add an item that's a Boolean, and we can name it EPA waste and say that it's false. So once we send it, then we get a response. The response is populated into an error message, and you can see that while the first little bit is not JSON, we do have a JSON format here. So what we'll be doing is we'll now use the JSON parse, and we'll be tearing this apart and putting it into the data window, which is a grid that has the different pieces of like error and message and field and value. So this is what the JSON object looks like. And what we're interested in is the error table. I'll call it a table. It's an array of objects, and each array seems to have 3 columns or 3 sub-objects: message, field, and value. They may not always have the value, and we'll have to deal with that. So the first thing we do to do the parse is create the parser. Then we take the response and we load it into the parser. It takes a quick look and tells us if there's any problem in parsing it out. If there is, then we'll have to handle that. If there isn't, then we start with getting the root item. The root item is always item number 1. Every element in the JSON package has a number, and it's just numbered sequentially. So the first thing that we want to do is get the item array called errors from the root. Now that we have the item, we can ask for a child count. This is effectively getting a row count. And each row then has its object, and so we address it by the row number by getting a child item. Then inside that, we go look for an item string called message and get that value. If that has any data, then we can create a new row in our grid data window. Then we can set the items with the data. The next thing after the message was the field, and we can put that in the data window. Finally, there may or may not be a value. It was a little surprising when I first tried to get that value. It didn't have it, and it threw an error. That's in PowerBuilder 2017 R3. PowerBuilder 2019 avoids that error by allowing you to ask if it contains that key. That returns a Boolean, true or false. Yes, it does have that value, so now we can get it without throwing an error. That's a way of looking before we leave. So we have some resources to learn about. The above link allows us to paste a JSON message to validate. Users can specify a schema standard to validate against. There are some things it won't complain about. The EPA has conditional flags that announce additional elements that must be present. So if you start talking about EPA wastes, then you're going to have these other things. That may not show up in the schema at the level it can validate. In many cases, these flags are required and the rules are outside the schema specification. I started this project by looking at Govinda Lopez's demo of the REST for Google Translate. It had a lot of very good things in it. It showed how to set things in the header. It showed how to make calls to the HTTP client. And it also demonstrated getting the response and parsing it out with JSON. There was also a very informative section on how to deal with multi-part content type. And that became very useful. So now we get to the demo. Wayt keeps a log of everything that was sent and everything received as a response, so that we can review the success or failure of any given e-manifest that we're trying to send. Here's a typical example. We have an instance value ready for signature not found in the enumerated values. And so it was saying, okay, it's ready for signature. Well, it's missing the R and the E. So what we have there, we can see in the schema validator. The schema allows us to paste a particular schema specification, and it says, okay, that's good enough for draft 4, that works. And then we can paste our JSON message with the e-manifest into the document, and it will validate whether it's good or not. So this looks like it's great. It has no problem with it. And if we were to remove a couple of characters, we have an error that it shows. We can also mess around with the date time, and it doesn't have the right format, so it's going to complain about that. But if it also had, like for the designated facility, we had something where it was complaining about the times. So the designated facility shouldn't have a signature date that's before the transporter brought the manifest to them. So internally, the EPA actually checks to make sure that they agree, and if it doesn't, it complains about that. But that's not something that the schema can validate on that level. So we're going to attempt to send this manifest and see what happens. Now I have this in debug. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to skip So when I got the first version of this, and I had been able to successfully get the security token back, I went, great, I'm on the right track. I didn't know about setting the content type in the header. They didn't have it anywhere on their site. So I put it together and sent the request. So then we get the response headers, and we can inspect them. And oh, look at this. What we've got, that's not JSON at all. What we have instead is HTML. And here it is, complaining about the JSON. It couldn't even parse anything out because there is no JSON. Let's try submitting it once more. This time we won't skip around it. Now we've got something. And now it's going to create that JSON parser and go after the code that we had just reviewed. And now we've got our signature. We already saw how that worked. And it also said that there's a manifest tracking number stored in the manifest database. So they already know about this manifest number. So now we're going to submit another one, and let's see how that works. So this is complaining about the hazardous waste, Texas waste code being too short. Now this is something that we can actually validate in the schema. This is really a data problem. So in the schema, that's further down. Right here. And all it's doing is saying it's got to be a certain length. This is the corrected version. So what were the hard lessons? First, we realized that error messages are important. Feedback to the user is important. We consume it and we produce it. And as we produce it, we ought to be thinking, what can we tell the user on what to do about this, rather than simply saying that we don't like it. That's more friendly to a user to guide them in the direction they need to go. If you want to do this, you'll need this and that and this and that. So we found out that we needed to put in a header something that they never talked about. And that was the content type for multi-part form data. We also realized that we had to put in a body. And that body has two parts. One for the manifest that contains the JSON, and another for the attachment. And we tell the name of the zip, and we have to tell it that it's an XZip compressed type application, and that the transfer is going to be encoded as binary. And also we learned that when we send things out, that if we're sending blobs, we need to encode them in UTF-8. So we can connect with the rest of the Appeon community in many ways. Here are some. And with that, I thank you for listening and have a good day.